So in this series of 5 videos, we're going to be thinking about Paul's letter to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians. And this is a letter that we study on the BA programme in the first year. And there's a couple of reasons why we highlight this particular letter in the first year. And the first is that it's a really good example of what a letter is and how you go about interpreting a letter. So we're all aware that what type of literature something is, its genre, makes a difference. We could read exactly the same sentence, say something like, "A lion has escaped from the zoo," in 2 different types of literature, so a newspaper on the one hand or a novel on the other, and we would understand something very different by it. It's the same when we come to approach the Bible. The Bible contains a number of different types of literature, and paying attention to what type of literature it is important in how we then interpret it. Now, all of the Bible is written into particular contexts, but with letters, the context is even more specific. And therefore, trying to pay attention to something of what's going on in the background helps us to understand what might be going on in the letters that we're reading. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 11, there's a fairly controversial and much disputed passage that's either about head coverings or hair, depending on how you interpret certain Greek words. This is quite a difficult passage to interpret, but it's made a little bit easier, at least, if we can understand something of the social norms at the time around hair and head coverings. So that's the first reason we highlight 1 Corinthians. It's a good example of how do we go about interpreting a letter. Secondly, and hopefully this will come through in this series of videos, 1 Corinthians is very applicable to today. There are a number of issues that Paul addresses in this letter, and a large number of them are very relatable to situations we might experience in our own churches today. So situations involving division, sexual ethics, what to do with spiritual gifts, how they're best used. These are all very relevant issues for us today. Now, we're not going to be able to cover all of 1 Corinthians, unfortunately. We're going to kind of dive in and out to a certain extent. But before we turn to the letter itself, we're just going to have a brief look at Paul's time in Corinth, which is recorded for us in Acts chapter 18. Now, at this point, I would encourage you just to pause the video, get your Bible out and read for yourself Acts chapter 18, 1 to 17, and just see what stands out to you about Paul's ministry in Corinth. Hopefully you've now done that. And you'll notice if you've done that Paul spends about 18 months in Corinth, which is quite a long time. The only place that Paul spends longer in is Ephesus, where he's there for about 3 years. And we read that Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth, and they work together as tent makers. And if you know something about Corinth, that there is a big amphitheatre there, that it was a place where people would come to for various different reasons and pass through, then we can see that Paul would make a good living there, that there would be lots of needs for people to kind of stay in temporary shelters as they go to and from in Corinth. Now, as is Paul's normal tactic, as it were, he starts in the synagogue. We see Paul's heart really for the Jews, his own people, for them to understand the truth of who Jesus is, that he is the long-awaited Messiah that the Old Testament has been pointing to. And meets with a measure of success, and certainly some of the Christians in the Corinthian church would be from a Jewish background. But we then read that there are some Jews who oppose him, and so he makes a statement that he's going to instead turn his attention to the Gentiles. And he ministers in the house of Titius Justus for a while, and sees many come to faith. Now, as is normal in Paul's ministry, it's not too long before there's trouble. And so we read in 12 through to the end of that little section. I'll just read this bit to us, that when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. And just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanour or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names in your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not judge of such things." So he drove them off. And then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul. And Gallio showed no concern whatever. Well, this little section is interesting in terms of just another example, one of many, of ways in which Paul suffers and comes into trouble and dispute as a result of his desire to communicate the good news of Jesus. It's also interesting for this little reference to Sosthenes. Now, we could be reading too much into this. It's not necessarily the case, but if we then turn to 1 Corinthians verse 1, we read these words that Paul, called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and our brother Sosthenes. Now here at Moorlands College, we've got 3 of us who all share the name Helen. We've had a few Ians in our time as well, so it's not definite that this is the same Sosthenes, but it's interesting to think maybe this person who's helping Paul out with this letter, probably as a scribe, was also sharing in his sufferings when Paul was ministering in Corinth. Well, Paul wrote the letter to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians, about 3 years after his time in Corinth, in around about AD 54. He wrote it from Ephesus, which is where he was on part of his second missionary journey. And in 1 Corinthians itself, we do get an indication of some of the reasons that Paul wrote this letter. So we read in chapter 1 that there are some people from Chloe's household who have essentially been snitches. You know, they've told on the Corinthian church. They've shared some of the problems that they've experienced. So the issues with division, the issue of sexual immorality, these are probably issues that Paul heard about from Chloe's household. But there's a second main reason why Paul is writing 1 Corinthians, and that is that he is responding to some questions and concerns that the Corinthian church themselves have raised in a letter to him. This transition point is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul says, now concerning the matters that you wrote about. And at this point, when Paul talks about marriage, singleness, meat sacrificed to idols, possibly too issues with the Lord's Supper and head coverings, although that might be things that he heard from Chloe's household. In that section there, Paul is responding to issues and questions that they themselves have raised. Now, as I've mentioned, knowing something about Corinth and the background into which Paul is writing does help us to understand some of the issues that have arisen and Paul's response to them. So Corinth was destroyed actually in about 146 BC, having been a flourishing city in the time of the Greek Empire. It was then rebuilt in about 44 BC by Julius Caesar. And so it's only been around in its kind of newer form for about 100 years when Paul is ministering there. But because of its location, which was on a narrow isthmus, what's called an isthmus, which is like a narrow bit of land, meaning that it was a good trade route, both for ships that were travelling from east to west and west to east, and also people travelling from north to south and vice versa. It get a lot of trade. Also had good access to natural resources, and these factors combined meant that it grew really quickly and became quite a successful city. So Anthony Thistleton, who is a very in-depth, robust 1 Corinthians scholar, he describes Corinth as a busy, bustling, cosmopolitan business centre. As well as being a business centre and a place of trade, it was a place that in particular promoted the power and prestige of the Roman Empire, a bit of a hub for Roman propaganda, as it were. So, for example, in Corinth, every year they would celebrate the emperor's birth. It was also home to something called the Isthmian Games, held at the big amphitheatre, which, second in size only to the Olympic Games, would have things like chariot racing, gladiatorial battles, athletics events, and so on. But in this guise, still promoting something of the power prestige of Rome and that propaganda. It was also home to what's called the imperial cult, which is in the kind of Western world, we tend to think about politics and religion as being two very separate spheres. Not so in many other parts of the world today, and also not so in the ancient world, where religion and politics were very much intertwined. And so one of the ways in which the Roman Empire would preserve its power would be through religion. So, for example, in Corinth, you have the Temple of Octavia, Octavia being Emperor Augustus's sister. And in addition to that, you'd have various other imperial statues and altars, places where people had to kind of make offerings to the empire scattered throughout the city. In fact, such was the impact of the Roman Empire that a scholar called Laszlo Galutz speaks of Rome shaping time and space, the very fabric of life in which people lived and moved and breathed was shaped by the Roman Empire. Shaped by time in, for example, the way which festivals would punctuate the year, the calendar year, and be kind of orientation points for people. But also the calendar itself. In the Western world today, we date our calendar back to Jesus' birth, although it's a little bit out, so we don't quite. But that's how we orientate our sense of time. How many years since the birth of Christ are we? Well, it was similar in the Roman world, but it didn't date back to Christ, but rather to the birth of Emperor Augustus, who was seen as bringing in this kind of new flourishing era in the Roman Empire. But it also shaped space through the way in which temples would be so dominant in the sky scene of Corinth, the way in which there would be altars and statues just everywhere that you looked. And so it'd be very in your face. You can imagine as Paul is walking around Corinth, he's not asking the question of, who's in charge here or what do people worship here. It's very evident to him, and perhaps at times would have maybe felt quite imposing to him. Now, some other just important features to highlight about Corinth before we, in the second video, start to dive into the letter itself. Corinth is somewhat renowned for its sexual immorality, although more recent scholarship has argued that perhaps this aspect of Corinth has been somewhat exaggerated. One of the reasons it's seen in this way is that a historian called Strabo described there being 1,000 temple prostitutes at the temple of Aphrodite, which was a temple located on the Acrocorinth, this little hill looking out over Corinth and over the sea, who was the goddess of love and fertility. But it is possible that Strabo was somewhat exaggerating in his claims, and also he was referring to what we might refer to as Greek Corinth, i.e. before it was destroyed in 146 BC. But nevertheless, it certainly was an issue. It was a port city, and port cities did tend to have particular issues with prostitution, for example. And just the entirety of the Roman Empire had, I think what we would see as fairly dubious sexual ethics. And so that certainly is a problem, and as we'll see, it's a problem that's infiltrated the church. Another interesting feature, not just of Corinth, but the entire Roman world, is what's called patronage. And this is where those who have wealth would give offerings and support those who were poorer than them. But it wasn't just a free gift, they would want something back, and that was usually in the form of kind of honour, boosting their status in some way, maybe building some sort of plaque to them or a statue, or just in other ways bringing about honour. Now this, I think, is helpful in understanding something of the power dynamics that we see going on in both 1 and 2 Corinthians. It's interesting, this is somewhat leaping ahead, but in 2 Corinthians we see in chapter 11, verses 7 to 15, Paul wanting to make a big deal of the fact that he wasn't financially supported by the Corinthian church. He was financially supported by other churches as well, which raises the question of why did he not want to be supported by the Corinthian church? And a probable explanation for that is that if he had been, there was a danger that particularly the more wealthy members of the Corinthian church might have seen themselves as patrons of Paul, and therefore there would have been strings attached. They would have expected something back from him. Well, for Paul, it was very important that he was tied to no human person. Christ was very much his Lord, and he didn't want to compromise anything that he did and said out of any sense of allegiance to anybody other than Christ. And then just one other aspect to mention is something called the sophists. These were sort of travelling philosophers, or perhaps better understood as travelling entertainers, maybe the stand-up comedians of the day, who would gather quite large followings and crowds and be very popular. And as today, where we can, boost our street cred, as it were, by associating ourselves with the in-person of the day, so too back in the ancient world, if you aligned yourself with a sophist who was particularly eloquent in their speech or particularly wise and clever and funny, then you could sort of have that reflected glory of, oh, I must be clever and wise to align myself with this particular person. We'll fairly soon in the next video dive into the issue of division in the Corinthian church. And it seems that something of this sort of allegiance and attachments to human leaders and that sense of reflected glory is playing a part in some of the divisions that we see in the Corinthian church. So in the next 4 videos, we will dive into the letter in a little bit more detail, and we'll see the various issues that Paul addresses and his response to them. And in many ways, these issues can seem quite unrelated and disparate, as if Paul just moves from one issue to the next, to the next, to the next. And it can raise the question of, is there any sort of unifying theme? Is there any common thread that runs through the letter as a whole? And I think if you are familiar with the Bible Project and their videos, I think their overview of 1 Corinthians draws out this kind of common thread that there is in 1 Corinthians really well. Their basic argument is that in every area of life, the Corinthian church are still too seeped in their Roman ways of seeing and behaving. They're still too embedded in their old lives. And as now a new creation in Christ, Paul's overarching aim is that every area of their life would be in conformity to the gospel of Jesus. That Jesus would be Lord and King over everything. That everything that they do and speak and the ways that they behave and the ways that they think would be informed and empowered by the infilling presence of Christ's Spirit within them. And Paul then is very specific about what that looks like for these different areas of life where there are issues. Now, as I mentioned at the start, 1 Corinthians has got a lot of pertinence for us today, a lot of similar issues. But as an even more general point, 1 Corinthians really encourages us to scrutinise and examine every area of life, to be alert and wise to ways in which our thinking, our speaking and our doing might be too enmeshed in the way that the wider world does things, ways in which our wider culture may have influenced us quite subtly at times. And 1 Corinthians challenges us to think through what might it look like for every area of our lives to come under the lordship of Jesus Christ, to be inspired and guided and empowered by the presence of Christ's Spirit within us.